Let's look at an example. Generating station has the following data. The installed capacity is 300 megawatt. Capacity factor is 50%. The annual load factor is 60%. And the annual cost of fuel is 90 million. And the capital cost is R1 billion. And the per annum interest and depreciation is 10%. We have to compute the minimum reserve capacity and the cost per kilowatt generated. Now, the command factor is the average demand over the installed capacity, load factor, average demand over the maximum demand. So if we take your factor divided by the load factor, then we get maximum demand over the installed capacity. Why doesn't that one want to admit? So the maximum demand is the installed capacity or the capacity factor divided by the load factor. That means it's 300 divided by 0.5 times 0.5 divided by 0.6. So that gives us 250 megawatt. Now the reserve capacity is 300 minus 250, it's 50 megawatt. Units generated per annum is the maximum amount times the load factor times the hours. So that's 250 times 10 to the power of 3 times 0.6 times 8760. That gives us 1,314 times 10 to the 6 kilowatt hours. Now the fixed charges is 1,000 megawatt rand times 0.1, that gives us 100 times 10 to the power of 6. That is the interest. So the total cost per annum is the fixed charges plus the per annum cost of the fuel. That gives us 190 million. So the cost per kilowatt is the total cost divided by the kilowatt per annum. So that's 190 times 10 to the power of 6 divided by 1,314. That gives us 14.86 cents per kilowatt hour. Then let's have a look at another example. The annual operating cost of a power station is given by R times A plus B kilowatt plus C kilowatt hour. Evaluate the values of A, B, and C for a 60 megawatt station operating at a per annum load factor of 50% from the following data. Capital cost of the building and equipment is 5 million. Per annum cost of fuel, oil, taxation, and wages is 900,000. Interest and depreciation 10%. The annual organization and interest of the cost of the site is 500 times 10 to the power of 3. So the kilowatt per annum is the maximum demand times the load factor times the hours, which is 60 times 10 to the power of 3, times 0.5 times 8760. That gives us 262.8 times 10 to the power of 6 kilowatt hours. Now A is the annual fixed cost, which is 500,000. B is the annual semi-fixed cost, which is 5 times 10 to the power of 6, which is the capital cost times 0.1 of the 10%. That gives us 500,000. Now B times 60 times 10 to the power of 3 is 500,000. So B is then 500,000 divided by 60,000. That gives us 8 Rand 34 cents. C is then your annual running cost, And C times the kilowatt hour is 900 times 10 to the power of 3. And therefore C is 900 divided by 262.8. That gives us 0.343 cents. So those are the A, B, and C that we had to calculate. Example 5. A hydroelectric plant costs 8,000 Rand per kilowatt hour of installed capacity. Per annum charges is 5% of interest. Depreciation is 2%. Operation and maintenance 2%. Insurance, rent, etc. is 1.5%. We have to compute a suitable two-part tariff if the losses in the transmission and distribution is 12.5% and the diversity of the load is 1.25. The maximum demand on the station is 80% of the capacity and the load factor is 40%. Determine the overall cost per kilowatt hour if the installed capacity is 100 megawatt. So the maximum demand is 100 times 0.8, that gives us 80 kilowatt. The average demand is maximum demand times the load factor, which gives us 80 times 0.4, which is 32 kilowatts. Capital cost of the plant is 100 Rand times 3,000, that gives us 300,000. Okay, annual fixed charges is 5% interest and 2% depreciation. So the fixed charges is 300 times 10 to the power of 3 times the sum of those two, which is 0.07. That gives us 21,000 Rand. Now the aggregate of the maximum demand is 80 times 1.25. That gives us 100 kilowatt. And therefore the annual fixed charges is 21,000 divided by 100. So that's 210 Rand per kilowatt of maximum demand. Now, annual running charges due to operation and maintenance, insurance, and so on is 1.5%. So the per annum running charges is 300,000 times 0.035. That gives us 10.5 kilo. And the kilowatt per annum is the average demand times the hours, which gives us 32 times 8760, which is 280.32 times 10 to the power of 3. So the units reaching the customer, remember there is a 12.5% loss. So it's 280.32 kilowatt hours times 100 minus 12.5. That gives us 245.28 kilowatt hours. Now the per annum running charge is 10,500 divided by 245.28 times 10 to the power of 3. That gives us 4.3 cents per kilowatt hour. And now in a two-part tariff, it will be 210 times kilowatt plus 4.3 cents times kilowatt hour. So the per annum total charges is 21 times 10 to the power of 3 plus 10,500 times 10 to the power of 3. That gives us 31,500. And therefore the cost per kilowatt hour is 31.5 divided by 242.28. That gives us 13 cents. So far, that is what I've done, written down. The rest we can look in the book. Let me just find it again. New share. Share. Oh man, what's going on? Back to the meeting. What's wrong now? Okay, here it is. Let me just make it a bit bigger. All right, you can read through that. Now, the significance of the load factor is in fact an index to the proportion of the whole time a generator plant is being worked to its full capacity. The generating equipment has to be selected on the basis of a maximum power demand that is likely to be imposed on it. Now, because of general nature of things, it seldom happens that the generating equipment has imposed on it during all 8,600 and 760 hours of a year, the maximum load which it can handle. But whether the equipment is being worked to its full capacity or not, there are certain fixed charges like interest, depreciation, taxes, insurance, part of staff salaries, and so on, which are adding up continuously. In other words, the equipment is costing money to its owner, whether it's working or idle. The equipment earns a net profit only during those hours when it's fully loaded. And the more it is fully loaded, the more is the profit to the owner. So from the point of economics, it is desirable to keep the equipment loaded for as much time as possible. So if the load factor is poor, i.e. the kilowatt hours of the electric energy produced is small, then the charge per kilowatt would be obviously high. Conversely, if the load factor is high, the number of kilowatt hours generated is large, then the cost of the production and hence the charge per kilowatt are reduced. So the fact that fixed charges per kilowatt hour increase with decrease in load factor and vice versa. So let's look at an example. A consumer has the following connected load: 10 lamps of 60 watt each and 2 heaters of 1,000 watt each. His maximum demand is 1,500 watt. On average, he uses 8 lamps for 5 hours each day and each heater for 3 hours a day. So we have to find the total load, the monthly energy consumption, and the load factor. So the total connected load will be 10 times 60 plus 2 times 1,000, which is 2,600 watts. So your daily energy consumption is 8 times 60 for 5 hours plus 2 times 1,000 for 3 hours, which gives us 8,400 watt hours. And the monthly energy consumption, 8.4 times 30, that gives us 252 kilowatt. The monthly load factor is the maximum demand there times 24 times 30, which gives us 23.3%. Okay, the load survey of a small town gives the following categories of expected loads. So we've got the residential load, 1,000 kilowatt, duty factor is 60%, the group duty factor is 3. Commercial lighting, 300 kilowatt, diversity factor 75, group diversity 1.5, street lighting 50, 101, domestic power is 300 kilowatt times 50 and 1.5, and the industrial power is 1,800, demand factor 55, group demand factor 1.2. What should be the kVA capacity of the substation, assuming a station power factor of 0.8 lagging? So for residential lighting, we have total maximum demand. It's 1,000 times 0.6, which is 600 kilowatt. Then the maximum demand of the group is 600 divided by 3, which is 200 kilowatt. Commercial lighting, total max, is 225 kilowatt. And maximum demand of the group is 225 divided by 1.5, which is 150 kilowatt. Street lighting, 50 kilowatt. Maximum demand of the group, the factor was 1, so that's 50 kilowatt. For domestic power, we have 300 times 0.5, 150 kilowatt. Maximum demand of the group is 150 divided by 1.5. That gives us 100 kilowatt. So industrial power is maximum demand is 1,800 times 0.55, which gives us 990 kilowatt. The maximum demand of the group is 990 divided by 1.2, which is 825. So total maximum demand on the station is 200 plus 150 plus 50 plus 100 plus 825, which gives us 1,325 kilowatt. The capacity of this substation required at a power factor of 0.8 lagging is that divided by 0.8, which gives us 1656 kVA. So as you can see, there's a lot of stuff that you have to know. Your demand factor, your load factor. Okay, a consumer has the following load schedule for a day. From midnight to 6 a.m. is 200 watt. From 6 a.m. to 12 noon, 3 kilowatt. From 12 noon to 1, 100 watt. From 1 to 4, 4 kilowatt. And then 4 to 9 is 2,000 watt. And 9 to midnight again is 1,000 watt. We must determine the load factor. So if the tariff is 50 cents per kilowatt of maximum demand, plus 35 cents per kilowatt hour, find the daily bill. So energy consumed per day in 24 hours is 200 times 6, plus 3,000 times 6 hours, plus 100 times 1 hour, and then 4,000 times 3 hours, and 2,000 times 5 hours, and then again 1,000 for 3 hours. That gives us 44,300 watt hours. Average power is 44,300 divided by 24. That gives us 1846 watts. The daily load factor, average power divided by the maximum demand, is 1846 divided by the maximum demand is 4,000, which is 46.1%. Now, since the maximum demand is 4 kilowatt, the maximum demand charge is 4 times half, because that's 50, it's half rand. So that gives us 2. And then energy consumed, 44.3 kilowatt hour. Energy charge is 35 cents out of 100. That gives us 15.5. So the daily bill will be the 2 plus 15.5, which gives us 17.5 Rand. A generating station has a connected load of 43,000 kilowatt, maximum demand of 20,000 kilowatt, the units generated being 61,500,000 for the year. Calculate the load factor and the demand factor. So the demand factor is the maximum demand divided by the connected load. Maximum demand is 20 kilowatt. And the connected load should be at 43. So that gives us 46.5%. The average power is 61,500 divided by the number of hours, which is 8,760 per year. That gives us 720 watts. So the load factor is the average power divided by the maximum demand. So that's that 7,020 divided by 20,000. That gives us 0.35 or 35.1%. And a 100 megawatt power station delivers 100 megawatt for 2 hours, 50 megawatt for 6 hours, and is shut down for the rest of the day. It's also shut down for maintenance for 45 days each year. We must calculate the annual load factor. So the station operates 365 minus 45, which is 320 days. Hence the number of megawatts is 100 megawatts times 2 times 320 plus 50 megawatt times 6 for 320 hours. So that gives us 160,000 megawatt. So the maximum number of amount of megawatt hours which can be supplied per year with a maximum demand of 100 megawatt is 100 times 320 times 24. That gives us 768,000 megawatt. So the load factor is kilowatt hours divided by the maximum demand. So what's 160 divided by 760, which is 20.8%. Right, differentiate, all right, forget about that. Calculate the cost per kilowatt hour delivered from the generating station whose capital cost is $1 million. Annual cost of fuel is 500,000. Wages and taxes also 500,000. Maximum demand load factor is 10,000 kilowatt. Rate of interest and depreciation is 10%. The annual load factor is 50%. And the total number of hours in a year is 8,760. So the average power demand, maximum load times the load factor, 10,000 times 0.5 is 5,000 kilowatt. Units supplied per year, it's 5,000 times 8,760, which gives us 438 times 10 to the power of 5 kilowatt hours. The annual cost of the fuel plus wages, in just 1 second. Ek gaan jou terugbel, ek is besig met klas hoor. Bye. Okay. Ja, hy lei nie lekker nie man. Okay, sorry. And the cost of the fuel plus wages is 6 times 10 to the power of 5. Interest and depreciation, 10%. That means it's 106 times 10%, which gives us, oh, that's 10 to the power of 6, no? Times 0.1. That gives us 10 to the power of 5. So the total annual charges is 7 times 10 to the power of 5. The cost per kilowatt is 7 times 10 to the power of 5 divided by the number of units supplied by the year, which is 438. That gives us 1.6 cents. All right, this one, 510, is basically the same as the other one that we've done. Yeah, basically the same. So go through these examples. If you have a query, just WhatsApp me. I'll answer as fast as possible. Any questions? Nothing.